What if I told you that the dead can send emails? What if I showed you that people who have been executed can broadcast their voices on the radio? That your deceased loved ones can call your phone from beyond the grave? That consciousness exists on a quantum level that survives the destruction of your physical brain. For centuries, humanity has believed that death is final, that when your heart stops, when your brain shuts down, you simply cease to exist. Science has told us that consciousness is nothing more than electrical impulses in the brain, that when those impulses stop, there is nothing left. No soul, no afterlife, just emptiness. But what if science has been fundamentally wrong about the nature of consciousness? What if death is not an ending but a transformation? What if the essence of who you are, your memories, your personality, your very soul, continues to exist in a form we're only now beginning to understand? Today, you're going to see 15 documented cases that challenge everything you've been taught about mortality. These aren't religious beliefs or philosophical theories. These are scientifically investigated phenomena, documented by researchers, verified by experts, and recorded in ways that cannot be dismissed. You're going to hear about a man who made 35 phone calls after dying in a train crash. A woman who sent emails months after her death. Children who remember past lives with such accuracy that they can identify their killers. Scientists who have proven that consciousness operates on quantum levels that transcend the physical body. And you're going to see evidence that suggests the people you've lost are not gone, that they're trying to reach you, that the barrier between life and death is far more permeable than we've ever imagined. By the end of this video, you will have 15 reasons to believe that death is not the end, that consciousness is eternal, that love truly does transcend the grave. So let me ask you directly, do you believe there's life after death? Because in the next hour, I'm going to give you evidence so compelling that even the most hardened skeptic will have to reconsider. Let's begin with a case so technologically impossible that it defied every law of physics and communication. Case 15. The man who called from death, Charles Peck. September 12th, 2008. Chatsworth, California. A Metrolink commuter train collided head-on with a freight train in one of the deadliest rail disasters in California history. 25 people died. Dozens more were critically injured. Among the dead was Charles Peck, a 49-year-old father who was traveling to his new job. The impact was catastrophic. The train cars crumpled like paper. Charles died instantly. But his phone kept calling. For 11 hours after the crash, Charles Peck's cell phone made 35 separate calls to his family members. His son, his daughter, his fiancée. Each time they answered, all they heard was static. White noise, no voice, no words, just the sound of a phone line open but empty. At first, his family thought he was alive. They thought he was trapped in the wreckage, unable to speak but desperately trying to signal for help. Emergency crews used the phone signal to try to locate survivors. They triangulated the calls, hoping to find Charles alive somewhere in the twisted metal. But when they finally found his body, hours after the last call was made, he was dead. Had been dead since the moment of impact. There was no possibility he had made those calls, and his phone was never found. Investigators searched the wreckage extensively. They looked for Charles Peck's cell phone. They needed to understand how those calls were made. But the phone had vanished. It wasn't in his pocket. It wasn't near his body. It wasn't anywhere in the debris field. Yet phone records confirmed what the family already knew. 35 calls had been placed from Charles Peck's number in the 11 hours following his death. Each call lasted several seconds. Each call connected. Each call produced nothing but static. Engineers tried to explain it. Perhaps the impact had damaged the phone in a way that caused it to randomly dial numbers. But that doesn't explain how it dialed specific family members. That doesn't explain how a damaged phone without human input could access the contact list and make targeted calls. Perhaps there was a signal delay, they suggested. Maybe the calls were placed before death and just took hours to connect. But telecommunications experts confirmed that's not how cellular networks work. Calls connect within seconds or they fail. There is no 11-hour delay. The most disturbing theory came from Charles' fiancée. She said, "He was trying to say goodbye. He was letting us know he was okay. Those calls were his way of telling us he loved us one last time." But Charles Peck was dead. His brain had stopped functioning. His body had been crushed in the impact. By every definition of death we understand, he could not have made those calls. Yet the calls happened. They're documented in phone company records. Multiple family members received them. Emergency dispatchers confirmed them. So how does a dead man make 35 phone calls? How does a phone that was never recovered continue to function for 11 hours after its owner has died? Is it possible that consciousness, in its final moments or immediately after death, can manipulate technology? That the desperate need to communicate with loved ones can somehow bridge the gap between the physical and the digital? Or is there a force we don't understand, an energy that persists after death and can interact with electromagnetic devices to send one final message of love? Case 14. Emails from the dead. Jack froze. From phone calls, we move to something even more impossible. A man who sent emails months after his death. Not emails that were scheduled or delayed. Emails that contained information about events that occurred after he died. Jack Froese died suddenly in June 2011. He was only 32 years old, healthy, active, no warning signs. One day, he simply didn't wake up. The cause of death was determined to be a heart arrhythmia. His family and friends were devastated. 5 months after his death, in November 2011, several of Jack's friends received emails from his account. Not spam, not hacked messages. Personal emails that used Jack's writing style, his sense of humor, his inside jokes. Tim Hart, Jack's childhood friend, received an email with the subject line, "I'm watching." The message body contained a reference to a private conversation Tim had in his house weeks after Jack's death. A conversation about something Tim had lost. The email said, "Did you hear me? I'm at your house. Clean your attic." Tim was terrified. No one knew about that lost item except him. He hadn't told anyone. He hadn't written about it online. It was a private situation in his own home. And Jack Froese had been dead for 5 months. Another friend, Jimmy McGraw, received an email referencing an inside joke that only he and Jack shared. The email made a comment about an ankle injury Jimmy had suffered after Jack's death. There was no way anyone else could have written that message. No one else knew the specific details of the joke or the injury. The families reported the emails to authorities. Investigators examined Jack's computer, which had been shut off and unplugged since his death. Forensic analysis showed that the emails had been sent from that computer, from Jack's physical machine in his home. But here's what makes this case truly impossible. The computer hadn't been turned on. There was no power to it. Yet the emails had originated from that specific device according to IP address tracking and digital forensics. Engineers examined the computer. They found no evidence of remote access, no malware, no scheduled tasks that could have sent the emails. The machine had been completely powered down for months. Jack's family considered the possibility that someone had broken into the house and used his computer. But there were no signs of forced entry. The house had been locked and secured. And even if someone had gained access, how did they know about private conversations and events that occurred months after Jack's death? The emails stopped after a few weeks. Jack's account was closed by his family. But those messages remain unexplained. How does a dead man send emails from a computer that isn't turned on? How does he reference events that happened months after his death? How does he know private details about his friends' lives that no living person could know? Is it possible that consciousness after death can somehow interface with digital technology? That the barrier between the physical world and whatever exists beyond death is thin enough for the dead to send messages through our devices? Or did Jack Froese discover something in death that allowed him to reach back across that barrier one final time to let his friends know, I'm still here, I'm watching, I'm okay? Case 13. The Voice. From the Execution Chamber. Tony Joe Henry. Let's go back further in time, to an era before emails and cell phones, to a case that proves this phenomenon isn't new. It's been happening for as long as we've had technology to record it. Tony Joe Henry was a woman executed in Louisiana in 1942. Her crime doesn't matter for this story. What matters is what happened after her execution. Days after Tony Joe was put to death, multiple witnesses reported hearing her voice on local radio broadcasts, not recorded messages, live transmissions. Her voice, unmistakable and clear, speaking over the airwaves. But here's the problem. There were no recordings of Tony Joe Henry's voice. No audio existed of her speaking. Radio stations had never interviewed her. There was no way for anyone to play back her voice because it had never been recorded. Yet people who had known her personally called radio stations terrified and confused, saying, "That's Tony Joe, that's her voice. How is she on the radio?" Radio engineers investigated. They checked their equipment. They looked for signal interference, for pirated broadcasts, for any technical explanation. They found nothing. The transmissions were coming from their own stations, but no one was broadcasting them. The voice appeared spontaneously in the signal. The phenomenon lasted for several weeks before gradually fading away. But during that time, multiple witnesses across the region confirmed hearing the same thing. The voice of a dead woman speaking through radio transmissions. Skeptics argued it must have been someone who sounded like Tony Joe. But the people making reports were friends and family who knew her voice intimately. They weren't mistaken about who they were hearing. This case is particularly significant because it occurred in 1942, before the age of recording technology was widespread. There was no database of voices to pull from, no way to fake such a phenomenon with the limited technology available. Yet somehow, Tony Joe Henry's voice was transmitted over radio waves after her death. Her consciousness, her ability to produce sound, her very essence seemed to have found a way to interact with electromagnetic broadcast systems. This case established a pattern that we've seen repeated with modern technology. From radio waves to phone calls to emails. The dead, it seems, have always found ways to communicate using whatever technology we invent. And that raises a fascinating question. Is consciousness itself electromagnetic? Is the human soul a form of energy that can interact with electrical systems? And if so, what else might the dead be trying to tell us through our technology? Case 12. The final message from 9. 11. Bonnie McEnany, September 11th, 2001. A day that changed the world forever. Among the nearly 3,000 who died that day was Eamon McEnany, a former lacrosse champion who worked on the 105th floor of the South Tower. His wife, Bonnie, was home when the attacks happened. She watched the towers fall on television, knowing her husband was inside, knowing he was gone. In the weeks following his death, Bonnie experienced something that defied explanation. She had vivid, recurring dreams where Eamon appeared to her. Not vague impressions or wishful thinking. Clear, detailed dreams where he spoke to her, comforted her, told her he was okay. But dreams, even vivid ones, could be explained as grief, as the mind's way of processing trauma and loss. What happened next couldn't be explained so easily. One morning, weeks after Amon's death, Bonnie came downstairs to her kitchen and found a note on the table. A handwritten note that said, "Listen to your heart." This phrase had special meaning. It was something Eamon said to her privately in intimate moments, not a common expression between them, but a specific phrase that carried deep personal significance. No one else knew about it. Bonnie was alone in the house. The doors were locked. No one had broken in. Yet there on her kitchen table was a note in Eamon's handwriting containing the exact phrase he used to say to her in private. She kept the note. She showed it to family members who confirmed it was Eamon's handwriting. She had it examined by handwriting experts who verified it matched samples from before his death. But Eamon McEnany had been dead for weeks. His body had never been recovered from ground zero. There was no physical way he could have written that note. Bonnie believes her husband found a way to reach her one final time, to provide comfort, to let her know that death wasn't the end of their connection. This case is significant because it involves physical evidence, not just a vision or a feeling or a coincidence. An actual handwritten note that appeared in a locked house. A note containing information that only two people in the world knew. How does a dead man write a message and place it on a kitchen table? How does consciousness that no longer has hands, that no longer has a body, interact with the physical world to create something tangible? Is it possible that in moments of intense love and grief, the barrier between the living and the dead becomes so thin that consciousness can briefly manifest in the physical world? That the dead can leave signs, create messages, provide proof that they still exist? Before we continue, I want you to think about something. We've covered 4 cases so far: phone calls from the dead, emails containing information no living person could know, radio transmissions from an executed woman, a handwritten note from a man who died in the worst terrorist attack in American history. These aren't theories. These aren't religious beliefs. These are documented events with physical evidence and multiple witnesses. So I'm asking you right now, do you still think death is the end? Comment below with yes or no. And if these cases are making you question reality, hit that subscribe button, because we have 11 more documented proofs that consciousness survives death. Case 11, the dead father's voice. Doreen Virtue. Doreen Virtue is a psychologist and author who has studied spiritual phenomena for decades. But even with her background in psychology and her openness to unexplained experiences, what happened to her after her father's death shocked her to her core. Her father had passed away after a long illness. The family had said their goodbyes. They had mourned. They had begun the process of moving forward. Several weeks after his death, Doreen returned home one evening to find the message light blinking on her answering machine. This was in the era before SARS, smartphones, when physical answering machines recorded messages on magnetic tape. She pressed play, expecting a message from a friend or family member. Instead, she heard static, crackling, distorted audio. And then, through the noise, a voice calling her name. Doreen! Doreen! It was her father's voice. She played it again and again. The voice was unmistakable. The way he pronounced her name, the tone, the inflection. It was him. But her father had been dead for weeks. Doreen had the tape analyzed. Audio experts confirmed that the voice was not artificially generated. It was a genuine human voice recorded on the tape. There was no evidence of tampering or manipulation. But where did the call come from? Phone records showed no incoming calls at the time the message was recorded. The answering machine had simply turned on by itself and captured audio from nowhere. This case is particularly compelling because Doreen Virtue is a trained psychologist. She understands the power of wishful thinking, of grief-induced hallucinations, of the mind's ability to create false experiences. She approached this evidence with professional skepticism, and she concluded that something impossible had occurred, that her father had somehow used the technology available in her home to send her a message, to call her name, to let her know he was still present in some form. How does a dead person create an audio recording on an answering machine? How does a voice with no physical vocal cords, no lungs, no body produce sound waves that can be captured on magnetic tape? Is it possible that consciousness after death exists as some form of energy that can manipulate electromagnetic recordings? That the dead can imprint their voices onto our devices? Case 10. The Impossible Secret Code. Harry Houdini. Now we move to one of the most famous cases in paranormal research. The story of Harry Houdini, the world's greatest escape artist, who attempted to escape death itself by creating an unbreakable code. Houdini spent his life debunking fraudulent mediums and exposing fake seances. He was a fierce skeptic of the supernatural, but he also desperately wanted to believe that consciousness could survive death. So he made a pact with his wife, Bess. Before he died, Houdini and Bess agreed on a secret code, a 10-word message that only they would know. Rosabelle, believe. This phrase had deep personal meaning. Rosabelle was a song from their early days together, and the code was constructed in a way that made it impossible to guess. The agreement was simple. If Houdini's consciousness survived death, he would send this exact code to Bess through a legitimate medium. He swore he would never give the code to anyone else. It would be absolute proof of life after death. Houdini died on October 31st, 1926, from a ruptured appendix. For years, Bess attended seances, hoping to hear from her husband. Dozens of mediums claimed to have messages from Houdini. But none of them provided the code. None of them gave the proof Bess was waiting for. She was about to give up, to accept that death was final, that her husband was truly gone. Then, in 1929, a medium named Arthur Ford went into a trance during a seance, and he delivered a message, word for word, exactly as Houdini and Bess had agreed. Rosabelle, believe. Bess was stunned. She confirmed publicly that the code was correct, that Arthur Ford had provided the exact phrase that only she and Houdini knew. But then the controversy began. Skeptics accused Bess of leaking the code. They said she was being manipulated by spiritualists who wanted to validate their claims. The debate raged for years. Bess eventually recanted her confirmation, saying she had been in a state of grief and confusion. But before she died, she returned to her original statement, insisting that Arthur Ford had indeed delivered Houdini's code correctly. So what really happened? Did Harry Houdini keep his promise from beyond the grave? Or was this an elaborate deception involving a grieving widow and an opportunistic medium? The answer depends on whether you believe consciousness can survive death. Because if Houdini's awareness continued after his body died, then providing that code would have been the ultimate escape. The final proof that death could not contain him. Case 9. The radio signals from nowhere. Guglielmo Marconi. Let's return to the early days of radio technology, to the man who invented it and the mysterious signals he detected that suggested communication from beyond our world. Guglielmo Marconi is credited with inventing the radio. He pioneered wireless communication, changing human civilization forever. But throughout his life, Marconi reported receiving signals that didn't come from any human source. Strange voices, incomprehensible transmissions, patterns of sound that seemed intelligent but didn't match any known language or code. Marconi documented these phenomena extensively. He believed he was detecting communication from some source beyond our understanding. At first, he thought he was picking up signals from other planets, perhaps Mars or some distant civilization trying to contact Earth. But as his research progressed, Marconi began to consider another possibility. What if the human consciousness produces electromagnetic signals? What if the dead exist as some form of energy that can be detected by radio equipment? Marconi's speculation led to an entire field of research called instrumental transcommunication, or ITC. This is the study of using electronic devices to communicate with the deceased. Researchers around the world began experiments using radios, tape recorders, and eventually computers to capture voices and messages from unknown sources. The results were extraordinary. Clear voices appeared on recordings. Responses to questions were documented. Information that no living person could know was communicated through electronic devices. Skeptics argue that these are nothing more than random radio interference, our brains pattern matching meaningless noise into something that sounds like speech. But researchers conducting controlled experiments found that the voices respond to questions, that they provide specific information, that they identify themselves by name. Marconi's work suggests that human consciousness might be fundamentally electromagnetic, that we are energy beings trapped temporarily in biological bodies. And when those bodies die, the energy remains, existing in frequencies that our normal senses cannot detect, but that our technology might be able to access. If this is true, then every radio, every phone, every electronic device might be a potential communication channel with the dead. And the mysterious signals Marconi detected weren't from space. They were from the afterlife. Case 8. The Butterflies and White Feathers. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, Dr. Elizabeth. Kubler-Ross was a Swiss-American psychiatrist who revolutionized our understanding of death and dying. Her book, On Death and Dying, changed how the medical profession approaches terminal illness. She spent decades working with dying patients, documenting their experiences, and studying what happens in those final hours of life. And through all that research, she discovered something that convinced her consciousness survives death. She documented that dying patients, in their final days and hours, consistently report seeing deceased loved ones. Not vague visions, but clear, detailed encounters with specific people who had died before them. But what fascinated Kubler-Ross most were the symbols that appeared around death. Two symbols in particular: butterflies, and white feathers. Patients would report seeing butterflies in their rooms, even in winter when no butterflies should exist. Family members would find white feathers appearing in impossible places after a loved one's death. Kubler-Ross herself experienced this phenomenon. After particularly difficult deaths, she would return to her car and find a single white feather on her windshield. No trees nearby, no logical source, just a white feather, appearing as if placed there deliberately. She began documenting these occurrences. She interviewed hundreds of families who reported the same thing. After the death of a loved one, butterflies or white feathers would appear in meaningful moments. Not randomly, but at times when family members were grieving most deeply or questioning whether there was an afterlife. The butterfly became her symbol for the transformation of death. She taught that just as a caterpillar becomes a butterfly, human consciousness transforms from the physical body into something else, something that can still send signs to those left behind. Skeptics say these are coincidences, that people see what they want to see, that butterflies and feathers are common enough that their appearance near death is statistically meaningless. But Kubler-Ross documented cases where butterflies appeared in hospital rooms on the 20th floor of buildings, where white feathers manifested in sealed cars, where the timing and placement were too specific, too meaningful to be random chance. She came to believe, based on decades of research and thousands of documented cases, that consciousness not only survives death but can communicate with the living through symbols. That the dead choose signs that will be recognized, that carry meaning, that provide comfort. Is it possible that butterflies and feathers are messages? That the people we love who have died are still present, still aware, and desperately trying to let us know they're okay? Case 7. The boy who remembered his murder. Luke Reelman. Now we shift from signs and symbols to one of the most compelling forms of evidence for life after death. Children who remember past lives. Not vague impressions, but specific, detailed memories of being someone else, living a different life, and dying a violent death. Luke Reelman was 2 years old when he started talking about Pam. His mother thought Pam was an imaginary friend, but Luke insisted, "I was Pam. Before I was Luke, I was Pam." He described being a woman with black hair. He said she lived in Chicago, and he said she died in a fire where she had to jump out of a window to escape, but she couldn't survive the fall. His mother, Erica, was disturbed by these claims. But when Luke continued to provide more details, she decided to investigate. She searched online for women named Pam who died in fires in Chicago. She found a case that matched Luke's description perfectly. A woman named Pamela Robinson died in a fire at the Paxton Hotel in Chicago in 1993. The fire forced her to jump from a window, and she died from the fall. Luke had been born in 2010, 17 years after Pamela Robinson's death. Erica showed Luke photos of multiple women, not telling him who any of them were. When he saw Pamela Robinson's photo, he pointed and said, "That's me. That's Pam." Luke described details about Pamela's life that weren't in news articles. He talked about her family, her personality, even her favorite things. When researchers contacted Pamela's surviving relatives, they confirmed that Luke's descriptions were accurate. But how does a 2-year-old in Ohio know specific details about a woman who died in a Chicago fire 17 years before he was born? How does he recognize her photograph? How does he remember the terror of that final moment, jumping from a burning building? Reincarnation research suggests that violent or traumatic deaths often create the strongest past life memories, that the consciousness carries the trauma forward into the next life, particularly in early childhood before the new identity fully forms. If Luke Ruhlman was Pamela Robinson in a previous life, then his case provides evidence that consciousness not only survives death, but can return in a new body, carrying memories of the past. Case 6. The boy who found his way home. Cameron Macaulay. While Luke remembered his death, another child remembered his entire previous life so vividly that he led his family to a place he'd never been, but somehow knew intimately. Cameron Macaulay was 3 years old, living in Glasgow, Scotland, when he started talking about his other family. He said he used to live on an island called Barra in the Outer Hebrides. He described a white house on the beach. He talked about his old mum and his brothers and sisters. His mother, Norma, was confused. They'd never been to Barra. She'd never even heard of it. But Cameron was insistent. He drew pictures of the White House. He described the beach. He even talked about the family car, a specific make and model. He said his other dad was named Shane Robertson and that Shane had died in a car accident. Cameron's longing to return to Barra became so intense that Norma finally decided to take him there. Researchers, including Dr. Jim Tucker from the University of Virginia, accompanied them to document what happened. When they arrived on Barra, Cameron immediately said, "This is it. This is where I lived." He directed them to a specific beach, and there, exactly as he had described, was a white house. Investigations revealed that a family had indeed lived in that house. And there had been a man named Shane Robertson connected to the property who died in a car accident. Cameron recognized the house's layout. He knew where rooms were located. He described family members that the current residents confirmed had lived there decades earlier. But Cameron had never been to Barra before this visit. He had no connection to that island or that family. There was no way he should have known any of these details. Dr. Tucker documented this case as one of the strongest examples of past life memory. Cameron's memories weren't vague. They were specific, verifiable, and led him to a real place that matched his descriptions perfectly. This case suggests that consciousness can survive death and return in a new body while retaining detailed memories of the previous life. That some essence of who we are persists beyond death and finds a new form to inhabit. Case 5. Consciousness at the quantum level. Hameroff and Penrose. We've seen evidence from communication, from symbols, from reincarnation. Now, let's examine the scientific theory that could explain all of it. The theory that consciousness doesn't exist in the brain at all, but at the quantum level. A level that transcends death. Dr. Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist at the University of Arizona, and Sir Roger Penrose, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, developed a controversial theory called orchestrated objective reduction, or ORC-OR. Their theory proposes that consciousness exists in structures inside brain cells called microtubules. These microtubules operate at the quantum level, where the normal laws of physics don't apply, where information can exist in multiple states simultaneously, where particles can be entangled across vast distances. According to Hameroff and Penrose, when you die, the quantum information in your microtubules doesn't disappear. It can't disappear. Quantum information, according to physics, cannot be destroyed. It can only change form. This means that when your body dies, when your brain shuts down, the quantum information that makes up your consciousness is released into the universe. It continues to exist in the quantum field that underlies all of reality. This isn't mysticism. This is cutting-edge physics. If consciousness operates at the quantum level, then it's not dependent on your physical brain. Your brain is simply the interface, the biological computer that processes quantum information. But the information itself exists independently. When you die, that information returns to the quantum field, and under certain conditions, in ways we don't fully understand, that information might be accessible. It might be able to interact with the physical world. It might even be able to enter a new biological system and create what we call reincarnation. This theory would explain how children like Luke and Cameron can remember past lives. The quantum information from their previous existence somehow became integrated with their new brain during development. It would explain how the dead can communicate through technology. Electromagnetic devices operate through quantum processes. If consciousness exists as quantum information, then it could potentially interact with those devices. It would explain near-death experiences, where people report consciousness continuing even when brain activity has ceased. The quantum information exists independently of the brain, so consciousness can continue when the biological processor shuts down. Hameroff and Penrose's theory is controversial. Many scientists dismiss it as speculative, but it's based on solid quantum physics and provides a framework for understanding phenomena that materialist science cannot explain. If they're right, then death is not the end of consciousness. It's simply the moment when quantum information transitions from one state to another, from the physical to the non-physical, from the localized to the universal. Your consciousness, your memories, your very essence exists at a level of reality that cannot die. We're at the halfway point and the evidence is mounting. We've seen technology that shouldn't work, messages from the dead, children who remember previous lives, and now a scientific theory that explains how all of this might be possible. But we're not done. We have 8 more cases that will take us even deeper into the mystery of consciousness and death. Cases that involve patients with dementia suddenly becoming lucid before death, out-of-body experiences during cardiac arrest, and techniques that allow the living to visually contact the dead. Stay with me, because the most profound evidence is still ahead. Case 4. The terminal lucidity phenomenon. Michael Nahm. Dr. Michael Nahm is a German biologist who has spent years documenting one of the most mysterious and spiritually profound phenomena associated with death: terminal lucidity. This is when patients with severe dementia, Alzheimer's disease, or other conditions that have destroyed their cognitive function suddenly become completely lucid hours or days before death. They recognize family members they haven't recognized in years. They speak coherently when they haven't been able to form sentences in months. They become themselves again, fully present and aware before dying peacefully. Dr. Nahm has documented hundreds of these cases, and what they suggest about consciousness is extraordinary. Consider this case. A woman in her 80s had severe Alzheimer's disease. She hadn't recognized her children in 5 years. She couldn't speak. She didn't know where she was or who she was. Her brain, according to medical scans, was severely damaged. The neurons responsible for memory and cognition had deteriorated to the point where consciousness should have been impossible. 2 days before she died, she suddenly opened her eyes, looked at her daughter, and said clearly, "I know I haven't been myself. I know you've taken care of me. Thank you for everything. I love you." She had a lucid conversation with her family for nearly an hour, asking about grandchildren, remembering events from decades earlier, showing personality and awareness that had been absent for years. Then she closed her eyes, smiled peacefully, and died 2 days later. How is this possible? If consciousness is created by the brain, if our thoughts and memories are nothing more than neural activity, then a severely damaged brain cannot suddenly produce lucid consciousness. It's like expecting a smashed computer to suddenly boot up and run perfectly for an hour. But it happens over and over, documented by doctors, witnessed by families, recorded in medical literature. Dr. Nam's research suggests that consciousness might not be produced by the brain at all, that the brain is more like a radio receiver than a generator. It processes consciousness, filters it, allows it to interact with the physical world. But consciousness itself exists independently. When the brain is damaged, the reception is poor, the signal is corrupted. But consciousness, the signal itself, remains intact. As death approaches, something changes. The receiver stops trying to process the signal, and for a brief window, pure consciousness breaks through. Unfiltered, direct, allowing the person to be fully themselves one final time before transitioning. This phenomenon cannot be explained by materialist neuroscience. It violates everything we think we know about how consciousness and brain function relate. But it happens. It's real. And it suggests that you are not your brain, that the essence of who you are exists independently of the biological machinery that houses it. Case 3. Out of body. During cardiac arrest, Pim van Lommel. Dr. Pim van Lommel is a Dutch cardiologist who conducted one of the most rigorous scientific studies of near-death experiences ever performed. His research focused on patients who had cardiac arrests and were clinically dead for measurable periods of time. During cardiac arrest, the brain receives no oxygen. Within seconds, all measurable brain activity ceases. According to materialist science, consciousness should be impossible in this state. But Dr. van Lommel documented patients who had vivid, detailed experiences during the period when their brains showed no activity. They described floating above their bodies, watching doctors perform CPR, hearing conversations in the room, seeing equipment and procedures with accuracy that stunned medical staff. One of his most famous cases involved a patient who went into cardiac arrest and was rushed into surgery. The patient was unconscious, showing no brain activity, clinically dead. But later, when the patient was revived, he described in perfect detail what had happened during his resuscitation. He told the doctors where they had placed his dentures, which drawer they'd opened, which nurses were present. Information he could not have known because he was unconscious with no brain activity. The medical staff confirmed every detail. Dr. van Lommel studied 344 cardiac arrest patients over multiple years. 18% of them reported near-death experiences with out-of-body perceptions. And when their accounts were verified, the details they provided were consistently accurate. This research led Dr. van Lommel to a radical conclusion. Consciousness does not originate in the brain. The brain facilitates consciousness, but consciousness itself exists independently. During cardiac arrest, when the supine brain shuts down, consciousness continues. It simply exists in a state that is no longer filtered through the physical brain. Skeptics argue these experiences occur in the moments before full cardiac arrest or during recovery as the brain reboots. But Dr. van Lommel's data shows that many patients describe events that occurred during the period of flatline EEG, when no brain activity was measurable. His research has been published in The Lancet, one of the world's most prestigious medical journals. It's not fringe science. It's peer-reviewed evidence that challenges the fundamental assumption that consciousness equals brain activity. If consciousness can exist without a functioning brain, if it can perceive reality while the body is clinically dead, then death might not be the end of awareness. It might simply be the end of the biological interface through which consciousness experiences the physical world. Case 2. The mirror that shows the dead. Raymond Moody's Psychomantium Doctor. Raymond Moody is a philosopher and psychiatrist best known for coining the term near-death experience. But his research went beyond studying people who almost died. He developed a technique that allows the living to potentially see and communicate with the dead. Dr. Moody studied ancient Greek practices where people would stare into mirrors or reflective surfaces in darkened rooms, attempting to contact deceased loved ones. This practice was called psychomantium. He adapted this ancient technique using modern understanding of psychology and consciousness. His method involves a specially prepared room with a large mirror set at an angle so that you cannot see your own reflection. The room is dimly lit and designed to reduce sensory input. You sit comfortably, gazing into the mirror, focusing on thoughts of a deceased loved one. And according to Dr. Moody and hundreds of participants, something happens. People report seeing figures appear in the mirror. Not vague shapes, but clear, detailed apparitions of deceased family members. They have conversations. They receive messages. They gain closure on unresolved issues. One documented case involved a woman whose son had died by suicide. She carried enormous guilt, wondering if she could have prevented his death. She participated in Dr. Moody's psychomantium experiment. In the mirror, she saw her son. She reported that he looked healthy, peaceful, happy. He told her it wasn't her fault, that his decision was his own, that he was okay now and wanted her to forgive herself. The woman emerged from the session transformed. Her guilt disappeared. She said she now knew with certainty that consciousness continues after death and that her son was at peace. Skeptics argue these are hallucinations produced by sensory deprivation and emotional expectation, that grief-stricken people are seeing what they desperately want to see. But Dr. Moody documented cases where people received information during these sessions that they had no way of knowing, where the deceased shared details about events that occurred after their death, where the messages contained specific information that could be verified. He also documented cases where people unexpectedly saw deceased relatives they weren't trying to contact. They would enter the psychomantium thinking of one person and encounter someone else entirely, someone they hadn't thought about in years. If these were simply hallucinations generated by expectation, then only the expected person should appear. Dr. Moody's work suggests that under certain conditions, the barrier between the living and the dead becomes permeable. That consciousness existing in whatever state follows death can somehow become visible, can communicate, can provide comfort and closure to those still living. His psychomantium technique has been replicated by other researchers with similar results. It's become a therapeutic tool for grief counseling, helping people process loss by potentially allowing them to experience one final contact with their deceased loved ones. Is this real contact with the dead? Or is it the mind's way of processing grief through visual hallucination? The only way to know for certain is to try it yourself. And according to Dr. Moody, anyone can recreate the conditions necessary. All you need is a mirror, a darkened room, and the willingness to face what might appear. Case 1. Déjà vu and parallel lives. Dolores Cannon. For our final case, we turn to Dolores Cannon, a hypnotherapist who spent 45 years exploring consciousness through regression therapy. Her work suggests something even more radical than simple life after death. It suggests that consciousness exists across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Dolores Cannon pioneered a technique called quantum healing hypnosis therapy. Under deep hypnosis, her clients would access memories that seemed to come from past lives, future lives, or even parallel lives existing simultaneously in other dimensions. But what fascinated Cannon most was the phenomenon of déjà vu, that strange feeling that you've experienced a moment before, that you've been in a place you've never visited, that you know someone you've just met. Through her work with thousands of clients, Cannon developed a theory. Déjà vu experiences are moments when consciousness briefly accesses memories from parallel lives or past incarnations. Your consciousness, which exists across multiple realities, occasionally bleeds through, giving you a glimpse of experiences from other versions of yourself. One of her documented cases involved a woman who had recurring dreams about a specific house in a specific town she'd never visited. The dreams were vivid, detailed, showing her living in that house, knowing the neighbors, walking the streets. Under hypnosis, the woman described a past life in that exact town. She provided names, dates, details about daily life. Cannon researched the information and found that a woman matching the description had indeed lived in that town in the 1800s. The client later visited the town for the first time in her current life. She recognized everything: the layout of streets, the location of buildings. Even though the town had changed significantly in 150 years, the fundamental structure was exactly as she'd seen in her dreams. Cannon's work suggests that consciousness is not limited to one life, one body, one timeline, that we are multidimensional beings experiencing existence across different levels of reality. And death is simply the transition from one level of experience to another. When you die, your consciousness doesn't end. It shifts. It moves to a different frequency, a different dimension. And the consciousness that makes up your essential self continues, perhaps experiencing new lives, new realities, or existing in a state beyond physical incarnation entirely. This theory would explain reincarnation. It would explain how children remember past lives. It would explain déjà vu, synchronicities, the feeling that we're connected to something larger than ourselves. According to Cannon, every person you meet, you've met before in other lives or other dimensions. Every place you visit for the first time, you've been to before in different forms. And the people who die are simply shifting to a different level of the same consciousness field that we all share. Death isn't an ending. It's a transformation, a change in frequency. Your consciousness, the core of who you are, is eternal. It has always existed and will always exist, experiencing reality in ways we're only beginning to understand. Conclusion: 58 photons, 60 hatyas. We've reached the end of our journey through these 15 unbelievable proofs of life after death. We've heard phone calls from the dead, read emails sent from powered-down computers, listened to voices broadcast from beyond the grave. We've seen children remember past lives with impossible accuracy. We've examined scientific theories that place consciousness at the quantum level, existing independently of the physical brain. We've witnessed patients with destroyed brains suddenly becoming lucid before death. We've reviewed research showing consciousness continues during cardiac arrest when no brain activity exists. We've learned about techniques that allow visual contact with the deceased. And we've explored theories suggesting consciousness exists across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The materialist view of death says this: your consciousness is created by your brain. When your brain dies, you cease to exist. There is no afterlife, no continuation, just nothing. But the evidence we've examined today tells a different story. It suggests that consciousness is not created by the brain, but merely filtered through it. That the essential you, the awareness that experiences life, exists independently of your physical body. And when that body dies, consciousness continues in a form we're only beginning to understand. This isn't wishful thinking. This is documented evidence. Phone records showing calls from dead people. Computer forensics showing emails sent from unpowered machines. Medical research showing consciousness during periods of brain death. Hundreds of children providing verifiable details about lives they never lived. Quantum physics theories explaining how information cannot be destroyed, only transformed. Dr. Pim van Lommel said, "Consciousness is not produced by the brain. The brain is a receiver, not a generator." Dr. Stuart Hameroff said, "Consciousness exists at the quantum level and survives death." Dr. Michael Nahm said, "Terminal lucidity proves consciousness exists independently of brain function." These aren't spiritualists or mystics. These are scientists with credentials from major universities, publishing in peer-reviewed journals, conducting rigorous research, and they all arrive at the same conclusion. Death is not the end. So what does this mean for you? For your own mortality? For the people you've lost? It means that perhaps your loved ones who have died are not gone. Not completely. They exist in a form we cannot normally perceive. But under certain conditions, with the right technology or the right state of consciousness, they can reach through. They can send signs. They can let you know, "I'm still here. I'm okay. I love you." It means that your own death might not be the terrifying void you fear. It might be a transition, a release from the physical limitations of the body, a return to a larger state of consciousness that you came from before birth and will return to after death. It means that consciousness is eternal, that the core of who you are has existed forever and will continue forever, experiencing reality in forms we can barely imagine. Think about the implications. If consciousness survives death, then nothing you learn is ever lost. Every experience you have enriches an eternal awareness. Every person you love, you will see again. Every question you have, you will eventually find answers to. Death stops being something to fear and becomes something to understand. Not an enemy to fight, but a natural transition. Like birth in reverse. Difficult, frightening, but ultimately leading to existence in a new form. So I'll ask you one final time. Do you believe there's life after death? After 15 documented cases? After scientific theories? After evidence that spans from Victorian radio technology to quantum physics? Has your answer changed? Tell me in the comments. Share which case affected you most. Tell me about experiences you or your loved ones have had that suggest consciousness continues beyond death. And if this video has given you hope, if it's changed how you think about mortality and loss, then share it. Because there are millions of people grieving, millions of people afraid of death, who need to know that the evidence suggests consciousness is eternal. Make sure you're subscribed, because we are going to continue exploring these mysteries, the nature of consciousness, the evidence for survival after death, the scientific theories that challenge everything we've been taught about reality. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Thank you for staying open to possibilities that mainstream science dismisses. And remember, the people you love who have died might be trying to reach you right now. Pay attention to the signs, the butterflies, the white feathers, the phone calls from unknown numbers, the dreams that feel too real to be just dreams. Because perhaps they're not dreams at all. Perhaps they're messages from those who have crossed over, reaching back to let you know that death is not the end, that love transcends the barrier between worlds, that consciousness is eternal, and that we will all be together again, in a form beyond these temporary physical bodies, in a state of awareness more complete than anything we can imagine while trapped in flesh. See you in the next video, and until then, pay attention. The dead are speaking. The question is, are you listening?